The North American P-51 Mustang was a long-range American fighter designed in 1940 to secure air superiority over Europe. After serving as a primary escort during World War II, it was redesignated as the F-51 and pressed back into combat during the Korean War for ground attack operations before flying in 1969. The Chance-Vought F-4U Corsair was a carrier-capable fighter built in 1940 with distinctive inverted gull wings. Beyond carrier duels across the Pacific in World War II, it delivered close air support during the Korean War and saw action with French forces in Indochina and Honduran air units in 1969. The Supermarine Spitfire was Britain's iconic short-range interceptor that helped win the Battle of Britain in 1940. Following World War II, updated variants entered combat during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War for both sides, while also flying operational missions in the Malayan Emergency and Greek Civil War. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain was a vital military transport aircraft introduced in 1941 to haul cargo and drop paratroopers. After moving Allied supply lines through World War II, it saw action during the Korean War, the 1947 Indo-Pakistani conflict, and as converted AC-47 gunships during the Vietnam War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was a heavy four-engine bomber, introduced in 1943, featuring pressurized cabins and remote guns. After ending World War II in the Pacific, it flew strategic bombing raids and night interdiction flights during the Korean War until jet interceptors made it vulnerable in 1953. The Douglas A-26 Invader was an American twin-engine light bomber that entered service in 1944. Renamed the B-26, it flew ground attack sorties throughout the Korean War, supported French operations in the First Indochina War, and participated in the 1961 Bay of Pigs and the Vietnam War. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was Germany's core fighter throughout World War II, first taking flight back in 1935. Following 1945, Czech-built Avia S-199 derivatives formed Israel's first operational fighter squadron during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, while Spanish variants saw combat in the 1957 IFNI War. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was a four-engine heavy bomber developed in the 1930s for high-altitude daylight raids. After dropping thousands of tons of munitions over Europe in World War II, three covertly acquired units flew bombing missions over Cairo and Gaza during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a heavy American fighter bomber introduced in 1942 that dominated low-level tactical ground strikes. After World War II, surplus units flew combat missions in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the 1954 Guatemalan coup, and several Latin American border disputes into the 1950s. The North American B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine medium bomber introduced in 1941, famously known for the 1942 Doolittle raid. Post-World War II operations saw the bomber used in combat during the Indonesian National Revolution, the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, and various South American border conflicts. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a rugged US Navy carrier fighter, introduced in 1943 to counter the Mitsubishi Zero. Following its service across the Pacific in World War II, French naval units deployed Hellcats for ground attack missions during the First Indochina War before its retirement from combat. The Grumman TBF Avenger was a heavy torpedo bomber introduced in 1942 that anchor-pinned American naval strike power in World War II. After the war ended, surplus Avengers saw combat with French Naval squadrons, flying anti-surface and strike missions during the First Indochina War from 1951 to 1954. The Grumman F-8F Bearcat was a carrier fighter built in 1944, designed for rapid climb rates and high agility. Arriving too late for World War II combat, it saw heavy air-to-ground action with the French Air Force in the First Indochina War, and later served in early South Vietnamese Air Force operations. The de Havilland Mosquito was a versatile wooden multi-role aircraft introduced in 1941 that excelled at fast bombing and reconnaissance. Post-World War II combat included reconnaissance flights in the 1956 Suez Crisis, strike sorties in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and combat during the Malayan Emergency. The Gloucester Meteor was Britain's first operational jet fighter, entering service in 1944 near the end of World War II. It saw heavy combat during the Korean War with RAAF No. 77 Squadron facing jet fighters, and flew ground attack and intercept missions for both sides during the 1956 Suez Crisis. The de Havilland Vampire was an early British twin-boom jet fighter introduced in 1945 just as World War II ended. It subsequently saw combat during the Malayan Emergency, supported French and Israeli forces in the 1956 Suez Crisis, and flew ground attack sorties in the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War. The Yakovlev Yak-9 was a lightweight Soviet fighter introduced in 1942 that became the most produced Soviet fighter of World War II. Following World War II, surplus units were supplied to Communist allies and saw air combat during the Korean War, flying interception and ground attack missions for North Korea. The Ilyushin Il-10 was a heavily armored Soviet ground attack aircraft introduced in 1944 to replace the Il-2 Sturmovik. After flying in the closing battles of World War II, it was widely used by the North Korean Air Force in 1950 during the opening ground offensives of the Korean War until replaced. The Lavochkin La-11 was one of the last piston-engine fighters built by the Soviet Union, developed from World War II designs in 1947. Operated by the Chinese People's Volunteer Air Force, it flew bomber escort and air defense missions against UN aircraft during the Korean War between 1950 and 1953. The North American T-6 Texan was an advanced single-engine trainer introduced in 1935 to prepare Allied pilots during World War II. Post-World War II forces adapted it into armed spotter aircraft, designated LT-6 Mosquito in the Korean War, and as light attack platforms in the Algerian War and Indochina. The consolidated PBY Catalina was a long-range maritime patrol flying boat introduced in 1936 to hunt submarines and rescue downed crews. Post-World War II operations included search and rescue in the Korean War, bombing missions in the First Indochina War, and recon in the 1947 Indo-Pakistani War. The Curtiss C-46 Commando was a heavy twin-engine transport aircraft introduced in 1941 that flew high-altitude supply runs over the Himalayas in World War II. After 1945, it served in the Chinese Civil War, supplied ground units in the Korean War, and flew in the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. The Short Sunderland was a large, long-range flying boat introduced in 1938 for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols. Following extensive World War II service, Royal Air Force Sunderlands flew maritime patrols during the Korean War and anti-insurgent missions in the Malayan Emergency. The Bristol Beaufighter was a heavy multi-role strike fighter introduced in 1940 that proved effective at night fighting and anti-shipping strikes. Post-World War II combat included Royal Air Force operations during the Malayan Emergency, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and the Indonesian National Revolution. The Hawker Hurricane was a single-seat fighter introduced in 1937 that accounted for over half of British aerial victories in the Battle of Britain. Following World War II, surplus Hurricanes saw combat with the Royal Indian Air Force during the 1947 Indo-Pakistani War and in the Indonesian Revolution. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was a four-engine heavy bomber introduced in 1941, produced in higher numbers than any other American aircraft in World War II. Post-World War II operations saw salvaged units restored and used as heavy bombers and transports by the Indian Air Force in the 1947 Indo-Pakistani War. The Hawker Sea Fury was a high-performance carrier fighter designed in 1943 that entered naval service right as World War II concluded. It saw heavy combat during the Korean War, where a British Sea Fury shot down a MiG-15 jet and later flew for the Cuban Air Force during the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk was an American single-seat fighter introduced in 1938 that saw widespread service with Allied air forces in all World War II theaters. Post-World War II combat saw Dutch forces deploy P-40S for tactical ground support missions during the 1945 to 1949 Indonesian National Revolution. The Junkers Ju-52 was a three-engine transport aircraft introduced in 1931 that formed the backbone of German air transport during World War II. Post-World War II, French-built copies designated AAC-1 Toucan saw active military service as transports and bombers in the First Indochina War and the Algerian War. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was a carrier-based dive bomber introduced in 1940 that sank key Japanese aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway in World War II. Post-World War II combat included French aeronaval dive bombing strikes in the First Indochina War and missions in the Indonesian Revolution.